I saved an alien, and he revealed the Ethiopian Bible's secret about Jesus' resurrection. I never believed in coincidences until the night I found him dying in the sand, his body radiating a light that haunted me since childhood, about faith and what lies beyond the veil of our understanding. The desert stretched endlessly around that sacred place, where monks had prayed for over 1,000 years, where the oldest Christian manuscripts slept in stone chambers untouched by time. I had gone out walking after evening prayers, drawn by something I couldn't name, a pull in my chest like a thread connecting me to the horizon. The stars above the Ethiopian highlands burned differently than anywhere else on earth, closer, more alive, as if heaven itself leans down to whisper secrets to the ancient stones. That's when I saw it, a streak of fire falling from the sky, silent and deliberate, arcing downward, not like a meteor, but like something descending with purpose. My heart seized in my chest as the light disappeared beyond a distant ridge, and every instinct told me to return to the safety of the monastery walls. Yet something deeper, something that felt like the voice of God himself, commanded my feet forward into the darkness. Climbed that ridge with trembling legs, my breath catching in the thin mountain air, completely unprepared for what I would find on the other side. There, collapsed in a crater of disturbed sand, lay a figure that made my mind struggle to reconcile what my eyes were seeing. He appeared human at first glance, arms, legs, a face contorted in pain, but his skin shimmered with an iridescent quality, like oil on water, and his wounds wept not blood, but something luminous and silver. Fear should have sent me running back to the monastery, screaming for help or hiding in my cell until sunrise burned away the impossible vision. But when his eyes opened and met mine, I felt something that transcended fear entirely, a recognition that pierced through every layer of my being, as if my soul had been waiting for this moment since before I was born. Those eyes held depths that human eyes could never contain, swirling with colors I had no names for, and in them I saw distant worlds and ancient sorrows, and a love so vast it made me weep without understanding why. He tried to speak, and the sound that came from his lips was like music and thunder woven together, a language that seemed to bypass my ears and speak directly into my heart. I fell to my knees beside him, my hands hovering over his wounded form, paralyzed between the urge to flee and the overwhelming conviction that this was a divine appointment I had no right to refuse. The desert wind had gone completely still, as if creation itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what choice I would make. In that suspended moment, I understood that my entire life had been a path leading to this precise intersection of time and space, that every prayer I'd ever whispered had been preparing me for what came next. My hands moved of their own accord, reaching for him, and the moment my fingers touched his shoulder, warmth flooded through me, not the heat of human flesh, but something that felt like pure light made tangible. He gripped my wrist with surprising strength, his shimmering eyes pleading, and though he spoke no language I knew, I understood him perfectly. "Hide me, please, just until dawn." Something in those words carried the weight of more than just a request for sanctuary. It was an invitation into a mystery that would shatter everything I thought I knew about God, about Christ, about the very nature of reality itself. I don't know how I managed to get him back to my tent, half carrying, half dragging his wounded form across the sand while the monastery slept in darkness below. He was lighter than any human should be, as if his bones were made of something hollow and sacred, and with each step I could feel power radiating from him in waves that made my skin prickle with electricity. The journey felt eternal and instant at once, time bending around us like the space around a star, and twice I had to stop as dizziness overwhelmed me from simply being in his presence. When we finally reached my small canvas shelter on the monastery's outer grounds, I laid him on my sleeping mat and lit a single candle, watching as the flame seemed to bend toward him as if drawn by invisible gravity. His breathing slowed, becoming more regular, and the silvery light bleeding from his wounds began to dim to a soft glow that pulsed in rhythm with his heart. I sat back on my heels, my own heart hammering, my mind racing through every Bible story I'd ever learned, every testimony of angels and visions. And burning bushes, this was no hallucination, no desert fever dream. The weight of his presence was too real, too solid, too utterly other to be anything my mind could conjure. I found myself praying without words, simply opening my soul to whatever was unfolding, surrendering to the terrifying and beautiful reality that heaven had just crashed into my life. The alien, for I knew now with absolute certainty that's what he was, turned his cosmic eyes to me again. And this time when he spoke, his words came in perfect, accented English that resonated with centuries of wisdom. "Thank you," he whispered, and in those two simple words I heard gratitude that spanned galaxies, and I knew that nothing in my life would ever be the same again. For hours I sat watching him as the candle burned low, unable to look away from the impossible being resting in my tent, his chest rising and falling with breath that seemed synchronized to rhythms beyond this world. The silvery glow from his wounds had faded to barely visible threads of light, tracing patterns beneath his skin, forming symbols and geometries that shifted and recombined like living equations. Every rational part of my mind screamed that I should be terrified, that I should run to the monastery and wake the priests, tell them something from the stars had fallen into our midst, but a deeper knowing held me there in silence. The same inexplicable certainty that had pulled me into the desert to find him, the sense that this moment existed outside the normal flow of cause and effect. I realized my hands were still trembling from the electricity of his touch, and when I looked down at my palms, I could swear I saw faint traces of that same luminescence fading from my skin like after images of lightning. The air in the tent felt thick with presence, as if the space between us was saturated with invisible meaning, every molecule charged with significance I couldn't yet comprehend. His eyes had closed, and I found myself studying his face, so nearly human, yet carrying subtle differences that marked him as utterly foreign, the proportions slightly too perfect, the bone structure suggesting a different evolutionary path under alien skies. I wondered how many light years he had traveled, what civilizations he had witnessed, what sorrows had brought him crashing wounded into this ancient Ethiopian desert, where Christianity's oldest roots ran deep into stone and sand. When his eyes opened again just before dawn, they had changed somehow, the swirling galaxies within them having settled into a focused clarity that made me feel simultaneously seen and transparent, as if he was reading not just my thoughts, but the very architecture of my soul. He sat up slowly, moving with fluid grace despite his injuries, and the way he looked around my humble tent carried such tenderness, such profound compassion for the simplicity of human existence, that tears sprang to my eyes unbidden. "You have questions," he said softly, and his voice had shifted too, no longer carrying that otherworldly resonance, but speaking with the warm familiarity of someone who had known me all my life. I nodded mutely, unable to form words, my throat tight with emotions I couldn't name, wonder and fear, and something like the homesickness you feel for a place you've never been. He extended his hand toward me, palm up, and I watched as the skin there began to glow again, light gathering and forming into shapes that hung in the air between us like holographic memories. "I am not human," he said, and hearing him confirm what I already knew still sent a shockwave through my chest. "But I have walked among your people since the days when you first looked up at the stars and wondered if you were alone." His words fell into the space between us like stones into deep water, creating ripples that spread through everything I thought I understood about history and faith. "I was there," he continued, his luminous eyes never leaving mine, "when the one you call Jesus walked the roads of Galilee, when he spoke of his Father's kingdom, when he promised that death itself would not have the final word. The air seemed to crystallize around us as he spoke that name, Jesus, and I felt my heart seize with a recognition that went beyond belief into the territory of absolute knowing. This being had witnessed the ministry of Christ, had been present during those 33 years that split human history into before and after, had watched with his galaxy-spanning eyes as God walked in dust and sandals among the broken and beloved. I thought of all the sermons I had heard, all the theological debates about the nature of Christ's divinity, all the scholarly arguments over what really happened in those ancient days, and suddenly they all seemed like shadows compared to the living testimony sitting before me. "You saw him?" I whispered, my voice cracking with the weight of the question, and the alien's expression softened into something that looked heartbreakingly like nostalgia mixed with reverence. "I saw him heal the blind with mud and spit," he replied. "I watched him weep over Jerusalem, knowing what was coming. I was hidden in the crowd when they nailed him to the wood and mocked him as he bled." His words painted pictures in my mind more vivid than any icon or painting, and I could feel the truth of them resonating in my bones like a tuning fork struck to the frequency of divine reality. "But more than that," he continued, leaning forward with sudden intensity that made the air crackle with energy. "I was there on the third day, when everything changed, when the tomb erupted with light and the entire cosmos trembled with the shockwave of resurrection. My breath caught in my chest as I realized what he was telling me, the magnitude of the testimony being offered, and I understood with crystal clarity why. Your providence had led me into that desert to find him bleeding in the sand. He reached toward me again, and this time, when his fingers touched my forehead, I gasped as visions flooded my mind, images that weren't quite sight, but something deeper, truth being downloaded directly into my consciousness in ways that bypassed language entirely. I saw Earth from orbit, beautiful and fragile, and I saw invisible observers stationed in the spaces between, beings of light and purpose who had been watching humanity's story unfold across millennia with breathless attention. I felt the weight of their vigil, the cosmic importance they placed on what seemed like one small planet in an ocean of stars. And underlying it all was a frequency, a resonant tone that pulsed through everything like the heartbeat of creation itself. "We have been watching since your beginning," the alien said as the visions continued to cascade through me. "Because your world was chosen for something unprecedented, something that would echo across every dimension and reach into every corner of the universe where consciousness dwells. I saw flashes of other worlds, other civilizations, looking toward Earth with something like hope and wonder, and I understood that what happened here mattered in ways that made my head spin with the implications. "The one you call God," he whispered, and his voice carried such reverence that I knew, whatever else this being was, he too bent knee before the throne of the Most High, loves not just your world, but all worlds. And what he did in Christ was a gift that transcended your single planet's salvation. Tears were streaming down my face now, hot and fast, as something fundamental shifted in my understanding of the gospel, expanding outward from a story about human redemption into something vast enough to encompass the infinite creativity of a God whose love knows no boundaries of space or time. The visions intensified until I could no longer distinguish between what I was seeing in my mind and the physical reality of the tent around me, the boundaries, dissolving like morning mist under the heat of revelation. I saw the garden tomb from angles impossible for human eyes, perspectives that existed outside linear time, and I watched as the pre-dawn darkness of that first day trembled with anticipation, as if all creation held its breath, waiting for the moment when death's grip would finally break. The alien's hand remained gentle against my forehead, but through that contact poured knowledge that felt both ancient and immediate. Memories that belonged to him, yet were being written into my very cells as he shared them with me. I saw Roman guards slumped in unnatural sleep, their weapons useless against the forces gathering just beyond the veil of visible reality, and I felt rather than saw the presence of angelic beings positioning themselves at coordinates in space-time that defied my comprehension. The stone was not rolled away to let him out, the alien whispered, his voice threading through the vision like golden wire through fabric. It was moved so that witnesses could see, and so that the evidence of empty grave clothes and absence of decay would testify to what had already occurred in dimensions beyond your three. I watched as light began to build inside that sealed tomb. Not the light of torches or dawn, but something fundamental, the raw luminescence of divine power, gathering like a storm about to break across multiple planes of existence simultaneously. The moment of resurrection itself struck me with such force that I cried out, my body convulsing as if I too was being transformed by energies too vast for flesh to contain. And the alien steadied me with both hands now, anchoring me to my humanity, even as he showed me things that expanded far beyond it. I saw Jesus' body begin to radiate from within, every cell igniting with light that was alive and conscious, and singing with frequencies that rewrote the fundamental laws governing matter and energy. The alien's voice came from everywhere and nowhere, explaining what my eyes were witnessing, but my mind struggled to process. Death is a corruption, a breaking of the pattern that God originally intended, and in that moment the pattern was restored, elevated, perfected beyond what even Adam knew in Eden's garden before the fall. I watched as the wounds in Christ's hands and feet and side blazed brightest of all, transformed from marks of execution into badges of victory, the very points where sacrifice intersected with triumph, becoming doorways through which divine love poured back into a universe that had been bleeding light since sin first fractured the connection between Creator and creation. The transformation accelerated until Jesus' entire form became translucent, visible, yet no longer bound by the limitations that govern mortal flesh. And I understood I was seeing not the resuscitation of a corpse, but the birth of something new, the prototype of redeemed humanity stepping into dimensions that had been locked since the cherubim first barred Eden's gates with flaming swords. What happened next shattered every assumption I had carried about the scale and scope of Christ's work, and I felt my theology expanding painfully to accommodate truth larger than the containers my tradition had built for it. The light erupting from Jesus' transformed body didn't stop at the tomb's walls or dissipate into the Palestinian morning. Instead, it pulsed outward in waves that accelerated beyond the speed of physics, carrying information and power and invitation across distances that made galactic measurements seem quaint and inadequate. Through the alien's eyes, I saw that resurrection frequency ripple across Earth first, touching every human consciousness in ways most would never consciously recognize, planting seeds of hope in hearts that wouldn't sprout for generations or even millennia. But the wave didn't stop at Earth's atmosphere, and as my perspective pulled back, I gasped, seeing it spread through the solar system, past planets and moons, racing toward the stars with undiminished intensity. Every civilization capable of perceiving it felt that moment, the alien said, and his voice carried the weight of one who had witnessed countless worlds respond to the shockwave of resurrection power moving through the cosmos, like the first word spoken into the void at creation's dawn. Some understood it as a distant hope, others as confirmation of truths they had intuited, but all recognized something fundamental had shifted in the relationship. Between mortality and eternity, between the Creator and his creation, scattered across infinite space. I saw glimpses of other beings on other worlds pausing in whatever they were doing, looking up or inward or through dimensions I couldn't name, all sensing that death itself had just suffered a mortal wound. The vision released me suddenly, and I collapsed backward, gasping for air, my body drenched in sweat and trembling, as if I had run for miles or fought for my life against invisible assailants. The alien withdrew his hand, but his eyes remained locked on mine, and in their swirling depths I saw infinite compassion for the burden of knowledge he had just transferred into my limited human consciousness. The resurrection was not merely spiritual metaphor or even physical miracle confined to one body in one tomb, he said quietly, giving voice to the understanding now burning in my chest like swallowed fire. It was a cosmic event, a transformation that registered across every dimension where consciousness exists, a declaration that the God who spoke galaxies into being had not abandoned his creation to entropy and death. I found my voice finally, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Why show me this? Why now? The alien's expression shifted into something that looked like urgency mixed with hope, and he glanced toward the tent's entrance where the first hints of genuine dawn were beginning to lighten the fabric. Because that frequency is stirring again, he said, and his words fell heavy with implication that both thrilled and terrified me. And your world stands at a threshold where the choice between awakening and destruction grows more acute with each passing moment, and there are truths that must be remembered, connections between faith and cosmos that must be restored before the time of decision fully arrives. I struggled to sit upright, my mind reeling from the weight of what I had just witnessed, and the alien moved with fluid grace to a weathered pack I hadn't noticed before, half hidden in the shadows of my tent. His fingers, longer than human proportions should allow, yet somehow perfectly formed, worked at fastenings that seemed to respond to his touch rather than any mechanical logic. And when the pack opened, I saw a faint luminescence spill out like captured moonlight seeking escape. You must understand, he said, drawing something carefully from within, that your species has known more truth than your current age remembers, that texts were preserved in some places, while others suffered the violence of editing and political convenience. What he withdrew made my breath catch, a parchment so ancient that by all logic it should have crumbled to dust generations ago, yet it remained intact, the surface covered in script I recognized as Ge'ez, the liturgical language still used in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, where I had spent these past months studying. The alien held it with reverence that transcended species, his alien features softening into an expression of profound respect as he explained, the Ethiopian Bible retained passages that were removed from other traditions, verses deemed too mystical, too physical in their description of divine events that theologians preferred to keep safely abstract and metaphorical. He unrolled the parchment with movements so careful they bordered on ceremonial, and even in the dim light of my tent, the characters seemed to carry their own subtle radiance, as if the ink itself had been mixed with something more than earthly materials. Here, he said, pointing to a passage near the top of the visible text, the witness describes what happened in that tomb using language that your modern translations have sanitized or omitted entirely. I leaned closer, my years of studying ancient languages suddenly, feeling inadequate yet necessary, and began to read aloud, my voice hesitant at first, then growing stronger as the words pulled me deeper into their testimony. The text spoke of Jesus' body radiating light as the doorway between heaven and earth opened, describing how the air itself became thick with presence, how reality seemed to fold and expand simultaneously, how witnesses saw beings of pure light standing in spaces that were not spaces, singing praises in frequencies that pierced the soul rather than the ear. My academic training wanted to analyze and contextualize, but something deeper in me recognized truth too large for scholarly distance, and my hands began to tremble as I read descriptions of Christ's resurrection body that were far more detailed and physical than anything I had encountered in Western biblical texts. The passage described how his wounds became portals of radiant mercy, how his flesh took on qualities that were simultaneously solid and translucent, how his presence filled the tomb, while also extending beyond it in ways the writer struggled to capture with available vocabulary. The monks here guard these texts as sacred treasures, the alien continued, his voice gentle as he watched comprehension and confusion war across my face. But even they do not fully understand what they preserve, the evidence of events that were witnessed not just spiritually but physically, scientifically, in ways that would bridge the false divide your culture has created between faith and empirical observation. He gestured to another section of the parchment where the ancient scribe had attempted to diagram what he saw, crude drawings that showed concentric circles and intersecting lines, a first-century attempt to map dimensional boundaries breaking down. This witness was trying to explain that the resurrection was not a violation of natural law, but the ultimate expression of it, the fulfillment of principles written into creation's fabric from the beginning, and what appeared as miracle was simply divine intention, operating at a level your science is only now beginning to theorize. I felt tears streaming down my face without remembering when they had started, overwhelmed by the realization that this being from another world had traveled unfathomable distances to share with me what my own religious tradition had possessed all along, yet partially forgotten. The aliens, and rested briefly on my shoulder, and the gesture carried comfort that transcended our biological differences, a reassurance that truth was meant to unite rather than divide, to expand rather than limit our understanding of a God whose love was vaster than galaxies, yet intimate enough to transform a single body in a borrowed tomb. Why me? Asked again, the question breaking from somewhere deep in my chest, where wonder and inadequacy collided with painful intensity, and the alien's smile carried sadness and hope in equal measure as he carefully rolled the ancient parchment and placed it in my shaking hands. Because you were willing to help a stranger who frightened you, because your heart remained open even when your mind filled with doubt, because you have spent years studying in this place where ancient wisdom waits for those humble enough to receive it, he answered, his words falling like benediction over my confusion and fear. Outside the tent, I heard a sound that didn't belong to the desert dawn, a distant mechanical thrumming that sent ice through my veins, even before I understood what it meant. And the alien's head turned sharply toward the noise, his entire posture shifting into alertness that confirmed my worst suspicions. "They have found me," he said simply, already moving toward the tent's entrance with speed that seemed impossible for his wounded condition, though I realized suddenly that the injuries I had treated hours ago had somehow vanished. His alien physiology having healed in ways my medical training couldn't explain. He paused at the opening and turned back, his galaxy-filled eyes finding mine one final time as the sound of approaching helicopters grew louder, and in that gaze, I saw an entire universe of meaning compressed into a single moment of connection that would mark every day of my life that followed. The scroll is yours now, a bridge between the faith you inherited and the cosmos your science explores, and you must decide what to do with truth that could change your world or cost you everything for speaking it, he said, and then he was gone, slipping into the pre-dawn light with the parchment's twin still glowing faintly in my trembling hands. Before the alien disappeared into the dawn, before the helicopters closed the distance between us and whatever military force hunted him, he turned back one final time and spoke words that changed everything I thought I understood about reality itself. "You have read the testimony, the words preserved by faithful scribes who recorded what their eyes witnessed, but words are shadows of experience, and I can offer you more than shadows if you are willing to see," he said, his voice carrying urgency tempered with compassion that acknowledged the terrible gift he was offering. I nodded without fully understanding what I was consenting to, my hands still clutching the ancient parchment, as if it might anchor me to something familiar while everything else dissolved into mystery. and the alien raised one long-fingered hand toward my forehead, with movements that seemed to bend the air itself around his gesture. When his touch met my skin, I felt no physical sensation at all, no temperature or pressure, only a sudden vertigo as my tent, the desert, the approaching dawn all vanished like mist burned away by impossible light, and I found myself standing in a place that was simultaneously nowhere and the most real location I had ever experienced. I stood in darkness so complete it should have terrified me. Yet somehow I could see perfectly, as if my eyes had been opened to frequencies beyond the normal spectrum of human perception, and I understood without being told that I was witnessing a memory, a recording held in consciousness that transcended any technology I knew. Before me materialized a stone chamber that I recognized instantly from countless artistic depictions, yet had never truly seen. The tomb where they had laid Jesus after the crucifixion, rough-hewn walls still bearing the marks of hasty preparation, a stone shelf where the wrapped body rested in stillness that felt like the pause between a question and its answer. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, and I realized I was not alone in this vision. Around me, in layers of reality I couldn't quite perceive directly, I felt presences, witnesses standing in dimensional spaces that overlapped with the tomb yet remained separate from it, as if creation itself had gathered to watch what was about to unfold. I saw figures that might have been angels or might have been beings like my alien guide, forms of light and geometry that hurt to look at directly yet filled me with longing rather than fear, and among them I sensed others. Representatives from worlds whose names I would never know, all drawn by something that called across the cosmos with irresistible gravity. The alien's voice came to me not through ears, but through some deeper faculty of understanding. Watch now what your scriptures describe, but what few have truly seen, the moment when death itself surrendered to the author of life. The body on the stone shelf began to glow, so gradually at first that I thought I might be imagining it, a luminescence that started deep within the wrapped form and slowly intensified until the burial cloths became translucent, revealing the broken flesh beneath that bore the marks of crucifixion's brutal efficiency. I wanted to look away from the wounds, from the evidence of violence inflicted on innocent flesh, but the alien's presence steadied me with wordless assurance that what began in suffering would end in glory beyond my capacity to imagine, and I forced myself to keep watching as the light grew stronger, brighter, until it seemed the body contained a star struggling to break free from the prison of mortality. Then something shifted. I felt it before I saw it, a change in the fundamental fabric of reality, as if creation itself inhaled sharply in anticipation, and the wounds in Jesus' hands, feet and side began to transform, the torn flesh becoming doorways that opened onto vistas of pure radiance that my mind interpreted as heavenly realms, though I knew they transcended any physical location. Light poured from those openings with such intensity that the stone walls of the tomb became transparent, and I saw through them into Jerusalem beyond, into the world beyond that, into layers of existence stacked like pages in an infinite book, all suddenly visible simultaneously. The wrapped body sat upright, though no muscles moved it, and the cloths fell away, as the flesh took on qualities that defied description. Solid, yet somehow translucent, physical, yet clearly no longer bound by physical limitations. A perfect fusion of material and spiritual that rendered obsolete every philosophical argument about their separation. The tomb erupted with energy that was light and sound and something beyond both, a frequency that I felt in my bones, my cells, the very atoms of my being resonating with recognition, as if responding to a voice they had been waiting to hear since the moment of their creation. Jesus stood, his resurrection body radiating waves of transformative power that rippled outward in expanding circles, and I watched in awe as those waves passed through the stone, through the earth, through the atmosphere, and into the resurrection energy expanded beyond Earth's atmosphere into the void of space. And in the vision, the alien showed me I could somehow perceive its journey across distances that would take light itself millennia to traverse. Yet this wave of divine frequency moved instantaneously, as if Christ's triumph over death had rewritten the rules that govern time and distance themselves. I watched worlds I had never imagined scattered across the darkness, like jewels on velvet, some teeming with life forms that bore no resemblance to humanity, others hosting civilizations far older than our own, and on each of these distant spheres I witnessed the moment when the resurrection wave arrived, sweeping across alien landscapes and through foreign cities with the same transformative power it had released in Jerusalem. On a planet where crystalline beings sang their thoughts into existence, the wave caused their songs to suddenly harmonize in ways they had never achieved before, creating melodies of such beauty that they wept mineral tears of joy without understanding why. On a world of vast oceans where intelligence moved through collective schools of luminous creatures, the wave synchronized their thoughts into unified consciousness that experienced, just for a heartbeat, the perfect love that connected all living things to their creator. The alien's voice resonated through the vision with words that trembled with emotion even in his measured tone. What you call the resurrection was not merely a local miracle confined to one tomb on one world, but a cosmic declaration that death, entropy, and separation from the divine are not the final words in creation's story. I struggled to comprehend the implications of what I was witnessing, my human mind stretching to accommodate concepts it had never been designed to hold. Yet somehow in that moment of vision, I found myself able to perceive connections between science and faith that had always existed, but which my limited perspective had kept hidden from view. The resurrection wave operated according to principles that were simultaneously supernatural and completely natural, I realized, because God, who authored physical laws, could work through them or transcend them as his purposes required, and the transformation of Jesus' body from death to resurrection life had released energy that quantum physics might describe as a universal wave function collapse, where infinite possibilities resolved into one glorious certainty. I saw scientists on distant worlds detecting unusual readings in instruments designed to measure cosmic background radiation, their equivalent of telescopes registering a pulse of organized information that carried meaning their mathematics could detect but not yet decode, a message written in the fundamental constants of physics themselves declaring that love was stronger than death. On Earth, I watched as saints and mystics throughout history experience moments of inexplicable joy or visions of divine light that they attributed to grace or spiritual awakening, never knowing they were feeling echoes of that original resurrection frequency still reverberating through creation like ripples spreading from a stone cast into infinite waters. Hope itself changed that day, the alien whispered, his words carrying the weight of personal testimony. Across 1,000 worlds, in 1,000,000 hearts, something shifted in the collective consciousness of all beings capable of recognizing the divine, and despair lost its absolute power over creation's children. The vision shifted to show me beings like my alien companion, scattered across their own world, when the resurrection wave had reached them centuries ago, by their reckoning, though it had been merely days after Christ's tomb stood empty in our history, and I watched as they raised their faces to their sky in wonder, as instruments and intuitions simultaneously registered something unprecedented occurring in the fabric of reality itself. Their civilization had long believed in a creator, the alien's voice explained, but had struggled as humans did with questions of whether that creator cared about the suffering of finite beings, whether death was truly an ending or merely a transition, whether the physical universe was all that existed or merely the shadow of something greater beyond perception's veil. When the resurrection frequency washed over, their world, their most sensitive equipment recorded patterns that could only be interpreted as organized information, a signal originating from a specific point in space that corresponded to our small blue planet, and their greatest minds immediately understood they had witnessed something that transcended normal physics, an act that could only be described as a message from the divine reaching across the cosmos to announce a victory over death itself. "We sent expeditions to investigate the source," he told me, his eyes holding galaxies that seemed to shimmer with barely contained emotion. "And what we found changed everything, for we discovered not only that we were not alone in the universe, but that the Creator's love extended far enough to reach every corner of creation, and that the sacrifice made on your world had implications that resonated through dimensions we were only beginning to understand." I found myself weeping without shame as the vision showed me the profound interconnection of all things, how Christ's resurrection had been simultaneously an intensely personal victory over the grave and a cosmic event that recalibrated the spiritual frequency of the entire universe, proving that God's love was not limited by distance or species or any boundary we might imagine. The wave continued its expansion in my vision, moving ever outward toward galaxies, yet unreached, carrying its message of hope and transformation to beings who would not encounter it for millennia by our time's measure, yet for whom the timing would be precisely when they needed it most, because God's providence operated outside the linear constraints that governed our mortal experience. I understood then why the alien had come to Earth now, why he risked everything to share this truth with someone who might carry it forward, because that same frequency was building again, as humanity approached a threshold where we would either embrace our place in this cosmic family united by divine love, or destroy ourselves through fear and isolation from the very truths that could save us. When the vision finally faded, and I found myself back in my tent with the alien's hand still hovering near my forehead, I gasped for air, like someone surfacing from deep water, and I knew with absolute certainty that I had witnessed something true, something that honored both the God I had worshipped all my life and the scientific wonder of a universe far more magnificent and purposeful than I had dared to imagine. The alien's hand withdrew from my forehead, leaving behind a warmth that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat, and as I struggled to process everything I had witnessed in the vision, he spoke words that carried both urgency and profound sadness woven together. "Like threads in ancient fabric. The frequency is stirring again," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, yet somehow filling the entire tent with resonance that made the air itself seem to vibrate with meaning. Across the cosmos, sensitive instruments and spiritually attuned beings are detecting patterns similar to those that appeared during the resurrection, though different in signature, as if creation itself is preparing for another threshold moment in the eternal story God is writing through time and space. I felt my breath catch in my throat as the implications crashed over me like waves against shore rocks, understanding without being told explicitly that he was describing something that would determine the course of not just human history, but the destiny of countless civilizations watching from distant stars. "Humanity stands balanced on a knife's edge," he continued, his galaxy-filled eyes meeting mine with an intensity that seemed to look straight through to my soul. "Between awakening to your true place in the cosmic family, united under divine love, or retreating into fear and tribalism that will ultimately consume you from within. And the choice your species makes will send ripples across dimensions, affecting worlds you cannot see and beings you have never imagined." I found my voice finally, though it emerged shaky and raw with emotion, that I could not fully contain or categorize, asking him what he meant by the frequency stirring again, whether God was preparing to intervene in human affairs as dramatically as he had through Christ's incarnation and resurrection. The alien tilted his head in a gesture that seemed both foreign and somehow familiar, his luminous form casting shadows that moved independently of any light source I could identify, and he explained that divine intervention never ceased, but rather operated continuously through means both obvious and subtle, through prophets and scientists, through mystics and artists, through anyone willing to become a channel for truth and love, regardless of how that truth might challenge comfortable assumptions. The stirring I speak of is not God initiating something new, he said with patience that reminded me of the great teachers I had known in the monastery, but rather creation responding to humanity's critical moment, as if the universe itself holds its breath waiting to see whether you will embrace the unity that quantum physics and ancient scripture both proclaim, or whether you will fragment further into competing narratives that deny the fundamental interconnection of all things. His words struck me with the force of revelation, because I recognized in them the very tensions I had witnessed in the world beyond the desert, the growing polarization between those who saw science and faith as enemies, rather than complementary languages describing the same divine reality, the increasing tribalism that valued ideological purity over the messy work of loving across difference. "Why now?" I asked, my mind racing through headlines and history, through prophecies and predictions that seemed to multiply in every generation, convinced they lived in the end times, trying to understand what made this moment uniquely significant, rather than just another cycle of human anxiety projected onto cosmic scale. The alien reached toward me again, but this time placed his hand over his own chest where a human heart would be, and I noticed, for the first time, that beneath the luminous quality of his form, there pulsed a light that synchronized perfectly with my own heartbeat, as if we were connected to the same source of life, despite our radically different origins. "Your species has reached technological adolescence," he explained, his tone carrying both hope and warning in equal measure, "where you possess power to destroy yourselves utterly or to reach beyond your planetary cradle and join the greater community of conscious beings scattered across God's creation. And such thresholds always intensify spiritual warfare between forces that serve divine love and those that profit from division and fear." I understood then that he was not speaking of some distant apocalyptic future, but of the immediate present, of decisions being made in laboratories and houses of worship, in government chambers and family dinner tables, choices that would accumulate like individual drops of water that together determine whether a river flows toward ocean or stagnates into swamp. The frequency stirs because God is calling humanity upward, he said, with sudden fierce joy breaking through his measured tone, inviting you to remember that you are not accidents of chemistry, but beloved children woven from the same divine love that holds galaxies in their courses and knows the number of hairs on every head across countless worlds. The tent seemed too small suddenly to contain the magnitude of what he was revealing, and I found myself trembling not with fear, but with something closer to overwhelming awe, the recognition that I was being entrusted with knowledge that carried responsibility I had never sought yet could not refuse. "What happens if we fail?" I whispered, almost afraid to voice the question, yet needing to understand the stakes of this cosmic moment he described. The alien's expression shifted into something that transcended the categories of emotion I knew how to name, a profound sorrow mixed with unshakable hope, and he told me that failure was never final in God's economy, that divine love was more patient and persistent than human minds could comprehend, but that the suffering created by rejecting our true nature and calling would ripple across generations and worlds in ways that would grieve the heart of the Creator, who had given everything to demonstrate that love was stronger than death. "You will not fail," he said, with sudden conviction that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his individual perspective, as if he was channeling certainty from a source that transcended both our species, because you are being given help from dimensions you cannot see, because the same Spirit that raised Christ from death is already working through millions of hearts to awaken humanity to the truth that you are not alone, that you are deeply loved, and that your destiny includes wonders that will make your current conflicts seem like childhood arguments forgotten in the joy of maturity. Outside, I heard the distant sound of helicopter rotors cutting through desert silence, and the alien's form flickered slightly as if his time here was running out, but his eyes held mine with an intensity that communicated more than words ever could, promising that this encounter was not an ending, but a beginning of something that would reshape everything I thought I knew about God's purposes in creation. The sound of helicopter rotors grew louder, a mechanical thunder that seemed to violate the sacred intimacy of what was unfolding between us, and the alien's luminous form flickered with greater urgency as he reached beneath the folds of his garment to retrieve something that immediately commanded every particle of my attention. What he drew forth appeared at first to be simple aged parchment, yellowed and fragile, as any ancient document preserved in monastery archives. But as he placed it carefully in my trembling hands, I felt it pulse with warmth that traveled up my arms and settled in my chest like a second heartbeat synchronizing with my own. The fragment was covered in symbols that seemed to shift between languages I recognized: Ge'ez, Aramaic, Hebrew, and scripts entirely unknown to human scholarship, characters that glowed faintly with inner light, that intensified when my fingers traced their elegant curves and sharp angles. This was transcribed in the decades after the resurrection, the alien explained, his voice quickening with the pressure of limited time, yet losing none of its profound gentleness, by witnesses who understood that what they had experienced transcended the vocabulary of any single culture or language. So they encoded the truth in layers that would only become fully comprehensible when humanity developed both spiritual maturity and scientific sophistication to recognize how perfectly they align. I found myself weeping without knowing exactly why, tears streaming down my face as I beheld writing that seemed to bridge every divide I had ever witnessed between faith and reason, between ancient wisdom and modern discovery, between the particular story of Jesus and the universal hunger for meaning that united all conscious beings across the cosmos. The symbols seemed to rearrange themselves as I gazed at them, not changing objectively, but rather revealing different dimensions of meaning, as if the text itself was alive and responding to the questions forming in my heart before I could articulate them in words. I saw equations that physicists would recognize, describing quantum entanglement and wave function collapse, appearing alongside psalms of worship that monks had chanted for centuries. The mathematical language and poetic language not contradicting but completing each other like two hands joined in prayer. The Ethiopian tradition preserved this when other churches removed verses that seemed too strange, too cosmic. The alien continued, kneeling beside me so that his galaxy-filled eyes could meet mine at the same level, creating an equality in our posture that contradicted everything my fear wanted to project onto him as either threat or superior being. Your ancestors understood something that modernity forgot, that God's love is not diminished by the vastness of creation but magnified, that Christ's victory over death was not limited by geography or species, but released a frequency of hope that propagates across dimensions wherever consciousness exists to receive it. His words unlocked something in the glowing text before me, and suddenly I could read portions that had seemed impenetrable moments before. Passages describing how the light that blazed from the empty tomb was observed by watchers in the heights, and how the news traveled faster than starlight to the far corners of the Father's house, where many rooms await the fullness of the family. I understood then that this scroll fragment was not merely historical document but active invitation, a bridge between worldviews that human culture had tragically separated, but that God's reality held in perfect integration. "Why give this to me?" I asked through tears that would not stop flowing, overwhelmed by the responsibility implied in possessing such a treasure, knowing that bringing this forward would invite skepticism from secularists who trusted only empirical proof and suspicion from fundamentalists who feared anything that expanded their careful theological boundaries beyond comfortable limits. The alien placed both his hands on my shoulders, and the touch sent waves of something like electricity, but warmer and more alive, coursing through my body, strengthening me in ways I could not fully articulate, but felt in the marrow of my bones and the core of my spirit. "Because you have lived between worlds already," he said, with a knowing that suggested he had observed far more of my life than just this single encounter, between the ancient faith of the monastery and the questions of modernity, between the mystical experiences you have known in prayer and the doubts that have sometimes made you wonder if you were deceiving yourself with beautiful fantasies. His words cut to the center of my deepest insecurities and greatest tensions, the internal divisions I had never fully resolved between the part of me that wanted absolute certainty and the part that had learned to trust in mystery beyond complete comprehension. "God uses wounded healers," he continued with such tenderness that I felt seen and loved in totality, not despite my contradictions, but somehow because of them. "Those who have walked through darkness and emerged with compassion for others who struggle, those who have questioned deeply enough to develop faith that is robust rather than brittle, flexible rather than fragile." The scroll seemed to grow warmer in my hands, as if confirming his words, and I realized that my entire life had been preparation for this moment, that every doubt I had wrestled with and every experience that had refused to fit into neat categories had been shaping me into someone who could receive this truth and carry it forward with both reverence and courage. The helicopter sound was nearly overhead now, and through the tent fabric I could see searchlights sweeping across sand and stone, hunting for something their instruments had detected, but their understanding could not properly categorize. The alien rose to his feet with fluid grace that reminded me of flame or water, elemental and beautiful, and as his form began to glow more intensely, I knew our time together was reaching its conclusion. "This scroll is not just information, but invitation," he said urgently, carefully rolling the fragment and sealing it in a cylinder that appeared in his hands from nowhere, made of material that looked like crystal but felt warm as living flesh. An invitation for humanity to see that science and faith are not enemies but complementary languages describing the God who is both intimately personal and cosmically infinite, both the Father whom Jesus taught you to address with in childlike trust, and the creative intelligence whose thoughts hold galaxies in elegant mathematical precision. He pressed the cylinder into my hands with finality that communicated I would not see him again, at least not in this form, not in this chapter of the story that was unfolding across dimensions I was only beginning to perceive. "Share this with those who have ears to hear," he instructed, his voice taking on a quality of blessing and commission that reminded me of ordination ceremonies I had witnessed in the monastery, with scientists humble enough to see that their equations describe divine artistry, with believers courageous enough to recognize that God's love is not threatened by the vastness of creation, but glorified by it, with seekers of every background who hunger for truth that unites rather than divides. I clutched the cylinder to my chest, feeling its warmth penetrate through fabric and flesh, to settle somewhere deeper than physical anatomy, understanding without being told that this object contained an power not of domination, but of illumination, truth that would attract those ready to receive it, while remaining opaque to those who approached with cynical hearts, determined to find reasons for dismissal rather than openings for wonder. The alien turned toward the tent opening, where searchlights now penetrated the woven fabric in sweeping arcs of harsh white brilliance that seemed almost profane after the gentle luminescence that had filled our sanctuary moments before, and I saw his form tense with the urgency of imminent departure. But then he paused and turned back to me with an expression that held both sorrow and determination. "Before I leave, there is something you must know about yourself," he said, moving toward me with purposeful steps that closed the distance between us in 3 strides. And before I could ask what he meant, his hand reached out to touch my side, just below the ribs, where a dull ache had lived for so long I had stopped consciously noticing it, accepting the discomfort as simply part of my body's landscape. The moment his fingers made contact, I felt heat unlike anything I had experienced, not burning but penetrating, a warmth that dove beneath skin and muscle to touch something deep within my abdomen that suddenly flared with pain so intense I gasped and would have collapsed if his other hand had not steadied me. "What you have lived with for 3 years is not the minor ailment your doctors dismissed," he said gently, as the pain reached a crescendo that brought fresh tears to my eyes, "but a corruption that would have taken your life within seasons, a darkness growing in silence that you would not have discovered until far too late for your medicine to address. I wanted to protest that I had been healthy, that I would have known if something so serious threatened me, but even as the denials formed, I recognized the truth in his words, understood that the fatigue I had attributed to spiritual struggle and the discomfort I had blamed on poor sleep had been symptoms of something far more sinister quietly stealing my future, one cell at a time. The heat intensified until I thought I might lose consciousness, and through the pain I felt something shift inside me, something wrong becoming right, corrupted tissue being unmade and remade according to the original template of health that disease had been systematically distorting. I could feel it happening with a clarity that transcended normal bodily awareness, as though the alien's touch had awakened perception that allowed me to witness my own cellular restoration, tumorous masses dissolving like salt in living water, while healthy tissue regenerated with speed that defied every biological law I understood. "The same power that raised Jesus from death is healing you now," the alien whispered, as the pain began to subside into profound relief, a sense of wellness flooding through me that I had not experienced in so long I had forgotten what true health felt like. The divine frequency that transformed his crucified body into resurrection glory, the love that refuses to let death and decay have the final word over any beloved child of the Father. His words connected my personal healing to the cosmic event we had discussed, making me understand that the resurrection was not merely a historical miracle to be believed, but living power continuing to operate wherever faith opened channels for its expression. And I realized that my healing was itself evidence of everything he had told me, proof written in my own flesh that the love which had triumphed over death 2,000 years ago remained active and immediate. Tears streamed down my face, but these were different from the weeping that had come before, not tears of overwhelming mystery, but of gratitude so profound it required physical expression, thanksgiving that I had been given not only truth to carry, but life sufficient to carry it, years that had been under threat of theft, now restored to me, for purposes I was only beginning to understand. "You were dying," the alien said, as he withdrew his hand, and I felt the last traces of pain evaporate like morning mist under risen sun, leaving behind only strength and wholeness that made me want to laugh and dance, despite the danger pressing in from every side. And you did not know it, just as your civilization is closer to critical thresholds than most comprehend, teetering between transformation and tragedy, between a future where you embrace your place in the cosmic family and one where you destroy yourselves before you can mature into the fullness of your calling. The parallel he drew between my personal condition and humanity's collective state struck me with the force of revelation, helping me see that my healing was meant to be more than private miracle, but prophetic sign, living parable of what God offered to the entire species if we could find the humility to receive help from beyond our own resources and the courage to believe that we were loved enough to be worth saving. "This is why I came to you specifically," he continued, "and I heard the helicopter rotors beginning to descend somewhere terrifyingly close, knew that we had perhaps seconds rather than minutes remaining, because you will be able to testify not only to truths preserved in ancient scrolls, but to power experienced in your own body, speaking not as scholar reciting facts, but as witness describing what you have personally encountered." His words settled into me with the weight of commission and calling, and I understood that I was being sent as surely as the disciples had been sent from the upper room, carrying news too important to keep silent, despite whatever ridicule or resistance I might face from those who found it easier to dismiss than to reconsider the boundaries of what they believed possible. I clutched the crystal cylinder more tightly and felt the warm pulse of the scroll within, answering my racing heartbeat, two rhythms synchronizing into unified purpose. "Remember," the alien said with urgent intensity as his form began to blur at the edges, light bleeding through the boundaries of his physical appearance, as though the effort of maintaining human comprehensible shape was becoming too costly given the need for immediate departure, "that what you carry unites rather than divides, expands rather than contradicts the truth that Jesus brought to your world, revealing that the God who became flesh in Bethlehem is the same God whose creative love speaks galaxies into existence and tends every sparrow's fall on countless worlds you have no names for yet." Outside, I heard shouts in multiple languages, commands being issued with military precision, the sounds of organized force converging on our location with determination that admitted no possibility of escape through normal means. The alien moved to the tent entrance, and I followed on legs that felt stronger than they. Had in years my healed body a testimony I would carry, even if all other evidence disappeared, and as he prepared to step out into the hostile spotlights, he turned back one final time with those galaxy-filled eyes that held such depths of compassion I felt loved beyond measure. "You were chosen for this, not because you are perfect, but because you are faithful, not because you have all answers, but because you are willing to live inside better questions," he said in blessing that felt like ordination and farewell combined. "And you will not walk this path alone, for the same spirit that empowered the first witnesses remains active, and there are others awakening to these truths across your world. A remnant being prepared to help humanity understand that God's story is larger and more beautiful than any of us imagined, terrible and wonderful beyond our small theologies, yet intimate enough to heal one broken body in a desert tent, because every single life matters infinitely to the heart that beats at the center of creation." Then he was gone, moving through the tent opening into the night that erupted with light and sound as his presence triggered responses from equipment designed to detect but not to understand, and I stood clutching the cylinder and touching my healed side, forever changed, forever commissioned, forever caught between worlds with truth too precious to keep, silent burning in my chest like swallowed starlight demanding to be shared. I stumbled from the tent into chaos that felt almost dreamlike after the sacred stillness I had just experienced. Military personnel shouting coordinates and securing perimeters, while searchlights turned night into artificial day that bleached all color from the desert landscape. And above it all I saw him ascending in a column of light so pure it made the spotlight seem dingy by comparison. A pillar of radiance that stretched from earth to heaven like Jacob's ladder made visible. The soldiers froze mid-motion as they witnessed what their training had never prepared them for, weapons lowering unconsciously as human instinct recognized something holy that transcended protocols and threat assessments. And in that suspended moment, I understood that his departure was itself a final gift, a demonstration that would plant questions in hardened hearts and disturb the certainty of men who thought they had mapped all reality's possibilities. The light intensified until I had to shield my eyes, and through my fingers I glimpsed the ship that had always been there just beyond normal perception, a craft of impossible geometry that seemed to be made of solidified song. And then, with a sound like distant thunder mixed with angelic choirs, it was gone, leaving only stars that seemed brighter than before, and the lingering scent of something like cinnamon and lightning. I stood clutching the crystal cylinder to my chest, while armed men slowly remembered their purpose and began converging on me. But I felt no fear, because I carried truth that no confiscation could steal, and healing that no interrogation could reverse, branded by encounter, that had transformed me from wandering scholar into commissioned witness. They took me to a facility I cannot name and questioned me with intensity that cycled between aggressive intimidation and careful persuasion. Men in suits without identification asking the same questions in rotating shifts, designed to exhaust resistance, wanting to know what I had seen and what I had been given, and whether I understood the security implications of contact with unidentified entities. I answered with a calmness that seemed to frustrate them more than defiance would have, speaking simply about truth and healing and a message meant not for governments, but for all humanity, explaining that what I carried was not intelligence to be classified, but hope to be shared. Good news too important to be locked in underground archives where it could be analyzed and ultimately dismissed by committees who trusted technology more than testimony. They searched me repeatedly, but never found the scroll because it existed partially outside the dimensions they knew how to measure. The cylinder warm against my skin beneath clothing they had examined a dozen times, hidden not by my cleverness, but by grace that protected what needed protection. Days blurred together in windowless rooms under fluorescent lights that never varied, but I did not break because I was held by certainty deeper than their confusion, anchored by purpose clearer than their protocols. And eventually they released me with warnings and restrictions that we both knew were meaningless, because you cannot threaten someone who has already died and been reborn in a desert tent under alien hands, channeling resurrection power. I returned to the world changed, carrying the scroll fragment that had become my most precious possession, and the healing that renewed itself each morning when I woke, amazed to feel no pain, no fatigue, only vitality that seemed to increase rather than diminish as I began the work I had been commissioned to do. I started quietly, sharing first with those I trusted, showing them the symbols that glowed softly in darkened rooms, and telling the story that sounded like madness until they looked into my eyes and recognized something there that skepticism could not explain away. A light that reflected what I had witnessed and made my testimony undeniable to hearts willing to consider possibilities larger than their previous certainties. Word spread through networks of seekers and scholars, contemplatives and mystics, scientists dissatisfied with materialism, and believers hungry for faith that engaged rather than retreated from reality's full complexity. And I found myself speaking to gatherings that grew from living rooms to lecture halls, not as expert asserting authority, but as witness offering testimony that others could weigh according to their own discernment. I spoke of the resurrection not as past miracle requiring blind acceptance, but as cosmic event with present implications, explaining that Christ's transformation had been both spiritual victory and quantum shift that rippled through creation's fabric, touching worlds beyond, number with frequency that whispered of love stronger than death and hope more durable than despair. And I watched understanding dawn in faces across every barrier of culture and creed, as people recognized truth their souls had always known, but their theologies had been too small to accommodate. The message I carried did not diminish Jesus, but revealed the full scope of his significance, showing that the salvation accomplished on Calvary and confirmed in the empty tomb was not tribal deity favoring one species, but universal God, acting through particular incarnation to heal all creation. And far from threatening faith, this expansion strengthened it, helping believers understand that the Christ they worshipped was even more magnificent than they had imagined, cosmic Lord, whose concern nevertheless extended to every individual heart, infinite God, who remained intimate, transcendent love, who was also immediately present. I met others who had encountered the visitors, scattered across continents and connected by experiences that institutional religion often forced them to hide, and together we began weaving testimonies into tapestry that revealed pattern and purpose. Understanding that the awakening the alien had spoken of was already happening, humanity being prepared for transition into fuller understanding of our place in God's vast household. The scroll's symbols began to make sense as science and spirituality. I studied both, ancient wisdom and quantum physics, illuminating each other until I glimpsed unity underlying apparent contradiction. And I realized that the division between sacred and secular had always been false boundary, that all truth was God's truth, whether discovered through telescope or testimony, laboratory or liturgy. I still touch my healed side sometimes in wonder, still wake before dawn to watch stars that I now know are filled with life that shares our longing for the divine. And I carry forward the commission given in that tent with joy that deepens rather than fades, because I know with certainty written in my flesh and sealed in my spirit that we are not alone, not forgotten, not insignificant, but beloved children of a Father whose creative love exceeds all galaxies, and who proved that love definitively when heaven touched earth in Jesus, the resurrection that changed everything, the gift not just to one world, but to the entire cosmos that waits with eager, longing for humanity to awaken and take our place in the family we were always meant to join. Could everything you thought impossible actually be the truth your soul has been searching for? Subscribe to continue this journey beyond the boundaries of ordinary faith.